In 1977, a beloved black pastor vanished from a small Arkansas town without a trace. No witnesses, no body, just a silence that shattered his family and fractured a community. 25 years later, a logger clearing trees found something buried under an old stump. A Bible, a robe, and a secret that someone had tried desperately to erase. What really happened to Reverend Elijah Freeman? And why did the truth stay hidden for so long? Marcus Freeman had given up on closure. For 25 years, he'd buried his questions deeper than the forest where his father had vanished. Elijah Freeman wasn't just a pastor. He was a cornerstone of the family, the church, and a fragile community in 1970s Arkansas, still scarred by racial tensions. The official line was that he left voluntarily. The community gossiped. Some whispered suicide. Others accused him of running from his faith. But Marcus remembered the way his father spoke about justice, the way he loved his people, the way he tucked him in every night with a prayer. Elijah Freeman didn't run. He didn't vanish. He was taken. And now Marcus sat stunned in a forest clearing, staring down at a bag unearthed from beneath a tree stump inside a Bible with his father's name. A robe. A note pleading with God about suffering and enemies who wanted to pull him away from the church. Evidence. After a quarter century. Detective Sarah Miller didn't make promises, but her eyes told Marcus what he already felt: this wasn't just lost property. This was a cold case reignited. Back home, Marcus dusted off his father's study, a room untouched since he boxed it all up decades earlier. The shelves held sermon notebooks, but not the 1977 volume. The year of his father's disappearance was missing both the Sunday messages and the personal diary. A silence where there should have been pages, desperate for answers. Marcus did what he hadn't done in 25 years. He walked back into Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church, the same pews, the same pulpit. But ghosts hung in the corners now. Pastor Harold Whitmore, now elderly, greeted him with visible surprise and something else. Was it guilt, fear, or just the weight of old age? "I'm Elijah Freeman's son," Marcus said quietly. That name carried power. The room went still. Reverend George Langston, once his father's closest church ally, joined them. The two old men danced around Marcus's questions. They remembered Elijah as kind, devoted, but troubled in his final days. Prayerful, quiet, spending long nights alone in his office. But Marcus had a better theory. He believed his father had discovered something dangerous. Financial misconduct, misuse of church funds. Two names had been faintly circled and erased in the margins of an old church finance textbook Marcus later found on a top shelf. His father's handwriting was clear, though damaged by time, Harold and George. They had been hiding something. Later that day, Marcus accidentally left his father's sermon notebook at the church library. When he returned that evening, he saw Pastor Harold and Reverend George at the church cemetery shoveling dirt over what they claimed was an old pet's grave. At night, in secrecy, with a bag that didn't belong to any dog. Suspicion burned hotter than grief. That night, Marcus spotted Reverend George speeding out of town, headed not toward home, but deep into the Ozark forest, with a shovel in that same mysterious bag. Marcus followed. He couldn't let the past disappear again. At Eagle Point Lookout, Marcus watched as Reverend George descended toward the cliff's edge. He carried the bag like it was poison, ready to discard it into the abyss. Marcus confronted him. "What's in the bag?" he asked. Silence. And then came the truth, or something close to it. "You know, don't you?" the Reverend hissed. Before he could dump the bag, police sirens pierced the night. Reverend George panicked. He lunged for the cliff, but was restrained just in time. The bag fell open on the ground. Inside, Elijah Freeman's missing 1977 sermon notebook and his diary. And beneath that, a tangle of human remains. The truth was no longer buried. Back at the police station, with lights humming overhead and sterile air in his lungs, Marcus watched forensic experts confirm what he already knew in his soul. The remains matched the DNA samples Marcus had submitted. They were his father's. The diary, though damaged, still whispered what Elijah hadn't dared speak aloud in his final days. "The missing funds are now over $10,000. I've confronted them. They deny it. But I cannot remain silent. I must act privately then with witnesses and if still unrepentant before the congregation. God give me strength. Detective Miller looked Marcus in the eye. Your father was murdered. Reverend George confessed. He and Harold, your father's closest colleagues, were embezzling church funds, and Elijah was going to expose them. They killed him to protect their secret, wrapped him in a robe, buried him beneath a fake grave, hid the evidence in the woods, and then carried on Sunday after Sunday preaching over a pulpit stained with silence. They nearly got away with it, but God had other plans. A forgotten notebook, a sick boy in a cemetery, a chance encounter. One thread tugged led to another until the whole rotten tapestry unraveled, and justice finally breathed. Marcus stood at his father's grave days later, as new soil was laid gently over a proper casket. Claire, the church secretary from decades ago, placed a bouquet of white lilies on top. He was our shepherd, she said, and he never stopped protecting us. The congregation mourned and healed. The truth, even delayed, had power. Reverend George and Pastor Harold were convicted of murder, obstruction of justice, and financial fraud. The trial unearthed decades of deceit, but also revealed the quiet courage of a man who had tried to do the right thing even when it cost him everything. In the end, Elijah Freeman was not remembered for the way he died, but for the way he lived, with conviction, with grace, and with a love for truth that could not be buried. The funeral was modest, as Elijah Freeman would have wanted. A reclaimed grave not far from the church he once led. His casket, draped in white cloth, was lowered into the earth with quiet reverence. Only now did the town finally mourn him properly. Men and women who had once doubted, once believed the rumors that he'd run away, abandoned his flock, lost his faith, now stood with bowed heads and wet cheeks. They realized they had lost more than a pastor. They had lost a man of principle, someone who stood firm in the face of corruption. And they hadn't even asked why. Marcus remained until the last handful of dirt was shoveled. His fingers brushing the gravestone carved with quiet dignity, Reverend Elijah Freeman, 1939 to 1977. The truth shall set you free. He didn't cry. He had cried enough in 25 years. But he felt something lift, not the pain but the weight of not knowing. Days passed, then weeks. Marcus returned to Mount Olive not as a mourner, but as a man seeking renewal. The old building creaked the same, smelled the same, but it was no longer hollow. The lies were gone. The ghosts had been named. Pastor Harold and Reverend George's names were scrubbed from the walls, from the records, from the pulpit they had once stolen. And Marcus was asked gently, quietly, if he might consider taking on a new role. He wasn't ordained. He hadn't preached a word in decades. He didn't feel holy. He didn't feel worthy. But when he stood before the congregation and read aloud his father's final sermon, the one he never got to preach, the courage to confront evil with grace, the church wept. Not because of Marcus, but because Elijah Freeman had returned. Not in flesh, but in legacy. Robbie the sick boy. Marcus had met at the cemetery, recovered well. His aunt and uncle, shaken by his illness and touched by the man who had helped him, began attending church again. And every Sunday, Robbie sat in the second pew watching Marcus with quiet admiration. You remember that day, Marcus asked him once. At your mom's grave, Robbie nodded. You said God could still use someone even when they're broken. Marcus smiled gently. Turns out he wasn't done with me either. The church slowly began to heal. New members joined. Old members returned. Marcus didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. He spoke honestly. About pain. About betrayal. About the years he hated God. And about the moment he felt him again in a hospital room holding grape juice and unleavened bread, praying over a child. One afternoon, as he was reorganizing the church library, Marcus came across another old notebook wedged behind a stack of hymnals. It was brittle with age, nearly falling apart. Inside were anonymous letters, confessions, written by various members of the church across years. They weren't addressed to anyone. Some bore shame, some sorrow, some secrets. But many of them mentioned Elijah. One wrote, "He knew I was stealing and never exposed me. Just left a Bible verse in my locker. Changed me forever." Another, "He came to my house when my son was in jail. Brought groceries. Didn't even mention church." Another, "He told me I was still loved after the abortion. I thought no one would say that." Marcus closed the notebook and placed it gently beside his father's other writings. For a man whose death was buried in silence, his life had whispered healing into dozens of broken places. That was the measure of him, not the robe in the bag, not the Bible beneath the stump, but the countless hearts he'd touched while he was still here. The forest that had once held Elijah's secrets had grown thick again with new trees. The stump that covered the evidence had rotted down to nothing, nature reclaiming what man had tried to hide. Marcus visited it one last time. He knelt there not to mourn but to mark it, to say, here injustice tried to grow roots. But truth cut it down. He stood slowly, the wind brushing across his face like a blessing. And he knew without a sermon or a hymn, without a choir or a steeple, that God had never left them. Not really. Not Marcus. Not Elijah. Not even the church. Faith like truth may falter, but it does not die. Not when someone is still willing to seek it. And on that day, standing in the hush of the woods where darkness had once buried light, Marcus Freeman finally walked out free. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Please like this video if you believe truth can still rise no matter how long it's been buried. Comment below your thoughts or prayers for families still seeking justice. Subscribe to Tim's Stories for more true emotional stories that matter. And share this video with someone who needs a reminder. Even in silence, the truth waits to be found.